This morning brought news that has already become one of the most discussed topics in military and political circles. A precision strike on a target deep within enemy territory resulted in the destruction of an industrial complex of strategic importance. Only ruins and smoldering structures remain at the site of the enterprise, which until recently was functioning and considered an important part of defense production. The operation, carefully planned and carried out with a high degree of secrecy, was a new signal that the conflict has entered a phase where strikes on industrial infrastructure are becoming crucial. It all began long before the first images of the flames appeared in open sources. Hundreds of kilometers from the line of contact, intelligence networks were at work. Agents were infiltrating various spheres of life in the region, recording every change and every movement of goods. To an outside observer, the plant looked like a normal, perhaps even boring enterprise, with gray buildings and the routine life of work shifts. But careful analysis showed that other tasks were hidden behind the facade. The delivery lists included equipment that bore little resemblance to components for consumer goods. The transport documents mentioned electronic units and systems directly related to modern unmanned technologies. This information formed the basis for the first analytical reports that landed on the headquarters desk. This is where technical intelligence specialists came into play. Satellite images, radio electronic intelligence data, intercepted communications, even mundane photos on social media showing workers posing in front of workshops. All of this came together to form a picture. The mosaic gradually took shape. Preparing for the operation was like playing chess. First, they figured out the weak spots in the security and air defense systems. Then they looked at the logistics. What days the shipments came in, how often the factory ran night shifts, where the warehouses with the most valuable equipment were. The analysis teams talked over dozens of options. Each step was checked several times to rule out accidental losses and achieve maximum accuracy. The agent network in the region played a special role. People who remained in the shadows transmitted coordinates, recorded transport movements, and noted the arrival times of security guards. Sometimes, simple observation from the window of an apartment across the street was enough. Sometimes more risky actions were required, photographing documents, removing small details for analysis, installing miniature sensors on trucks. All these episodes came together to form a living chronicle of the invisible front. At the same time, political coordination was underway. Any such operation requires approval at the highest level. Diplomats calculated in advance the possible reactions of neighboring countries and international organizations. Analytical notes featured scenarios ranging from mild statements about the need for de-escalation to the possible introduction of new restrictive measures. The leaders understood that the effect of the strike would be not only military but also political. Finally, when the information had been checked and double-checked, it was time to plan the strike. All important targets were marked on the map with meter-level accuracy: workshops, warehouses, administrative buildings. Engineers calculated what type of ammunition would ensure maximum effectiveness with minimal risk to civilians and surrounding buildings. The choice fell on an option that would allow a targeted strike, leaving no chance for the equipment to be evacuated. The operation was given a code name which is not disclosed, but among the participants it became a symbol of determination. The crews who were to carry out the mission prepared for several days. Guidance systems were checked, flight routes were refined, and options for evading possible interception were rehearsed. This preparatory phase concluded the first part of our story. In the next episode, we will take a detailed look at the moment of the attack itself, the reaction on the ground, and the initial consequences for the region. The night over the region was thick and starless. At such hours, most residents fall asleep, but for those involved in the operation, the hour of reckoning had come. The equipment was put on the routes in advance, several hours before the decisive maneuver. All systems were brought to full readiness. Each device was checked twice. Reconnaissance teams on the ground sent their final confirmation. The target was in place, the work shift was complete, and the trucks had left the factory yard during the day and had not returned. This meant that the likelihood of accidental presence of extra people was minimal. The command gave a short signal to begin. Everything looked normal in the air. Reconnaissance drones hovered at high altitude, monitoring the perimeter. The airwaves were clear, and the enemy's air defense system did not detect the approach. Specialists at headquarters watched every movement on their screens in real time. Their hearts were beating steadily, but the tension was palpable with every breath. The first combat aircraft set course. Their route took them through dozens of kilometers of neutral space, bypassing enemy positions. Navigation systems guided them precisely to the specified coordinates. When they reached the launch point, all that remained was to confirm the command. At that moment, everything was still calm for observers in the city. Only a slight rumble on the horizon foreshadowed the impending event. Moments later, the sky lit up with a bright light. The first explosions hit the factory buildings. The main production hall, where, according to intelligence, the electronic component assembly lines were located, took a powerful hit. Within seconds, flames engulfed the roof and walls, and the flash lit up the surrounding area. The next strikes hit the warehouses and administrative building. Outdoor surveillance cameras installed near the facility captured the moment. The screens clearly show the buildings collapsing one after another, and a thick column of smoke rising into the sky. This smoke was visible for tens of kilometers. The attack took the enemy completely by surprise. The defense systems did not have time to react. Only a few minutes later did the sirens start wailing and the first fire trucks arrive in the city. But the emergency services were powerless. The fire covered thousands of square meters. Metal structures melted, and the fire spread further and further. The headquarters closely monitored the situation. Data came from various sources. Satellites recorded the thermal image, drones transmitted real-time images, and the intelligence network reported panic in the city. Everything indicated that the target had been completely destroyed. The reaction of local residents was mixed. Some fled their homes in panic, while others filmed the events on their phones. Footage of the fire and explosions instantly appeared on social media. Comments ranged from bewilderment to outright horror. The enemy's political authorities immediately issued statements. According to the official version, the facility allegedly produced civilian goods. Household appliances, including coffee machines, were cited as examples. But analysts quickly pointed out inconsistencies. Video recordings from the factory premises showed boxes with markings that clearly indicated military use. In addition, independent experts noted that the scale of production significantly exceeded the needs of the household appliance market. Meanwhile, firefighters continued to battle the blaze. They were unable to contain the fire for 2 days. In the end, all that remained of the factory was a pile of charred structures. For military analysts, this was confirmation that the strike had achieved its goal. The systems used to manufacture drone components had been completely destroyed. The international community's reaction was not long in coming. By morning, statements appeared that the situation required careful analysis. Some countries expressed cautious bewilderment, while others called for an immediate investigation. But behind the scenes, politicians understood that this was a serious shift in the balance of power. That night changed a lot. For the enemy, it was a signal that even the depths of the rear did not guarantee safety. For supporters of the operation, it was an example of precision and determination. Thus ended the moment of the attack itself. In the third part, we will look at the initial consequences for the region, how this event affected military plans, and how it was perceived in diplomatic circles. The morning after the strike was difficult and anxious. The city woke up in smoke. Huge clouds of soot rose above the ruins of the factory, blocking out the sun. An unusual silence reigned in the streets, broken only by the sirens of fire engines and the occasional cries of eyewitnesses. People went out onto their balconies, filmed what was happening, and shared their own guesses online. The first serious consequence was the paralysis of the region's transport system. The roads around the plant were blocked, and truck traffic was halted. Hundreds of factory workers were unable to get to their shifts. Many of them only learned about the destruction of their workplace from the news. Some thought it was all a dream, but the ruins of the workshops and the ashes under their feet left no doubt. The economic blow to the region was significant. The enterprise provided jobs for several thousand people, and dozens of contractors were involved in its logistics network. Now they all found themselves in limbo. Local stores began to talk about disruptions in the supply of consumer goods and components. However, economists quickly noticed that these explanations did not reflect the whole picture. If it were only a matter of civilian production, the scale of the shock would not have been so great. The enemy's military headquarters began urgent work to restore supply chains. The destruction of the plant meant that one of the key lines for the production of electronics for unmanned systems was out of order. Within the first few hours, a decision was made to transfer some of the orders to other enterprises, but it proved impossible to do this in a short time. The region's production capacity could not compensate for the loss of such a large facility. The political reaction developed in parallel. Ministers and government representatives tried to convince the public that the enterprise was engaged exclusively in peaceful production. Official statements spoke of innocence and injustice, but journalists and analysts began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why did the plant have such a high level of security? Where did the military-grade electronic components on the invoices come from? Why had representatives of foreign contractors working with the defense industry been visiting this particular facility in recent months? Articles appeared in the international press emphasizing that the strike on the plant was not accidental, but carefully planned. Authoritative publications referred to satellite images and data from independent analytical centers. Photographs taken before the strike showed distinctive containers that are rarely found in civilian industry. Social media became an arena for fierce debate. Some users posted videos claiming that the factory allegedly produced coffee machines and household appliances. Others provided evidence to the contrary, posting images of markings on boxes and fragments of equipment. It gradually became clear that the official version could not withstand the pressure of the facts. Rumors began to spread on the streets of the city that new strikes could follow in the near future. Residents stocked up on water and food, and some left the region. The authorities tried to maintain calm, but confidence in them had noticeably declined. Meanwhile, think tanks in other countries began holding emergency meetings. Experts discussed how the destruction of the plant would affect the overall course of the conflict. According to one version, the enemy would be forced to reduce the pace of production of unmanned systems. According to another, it would try to compensate for the losses through imports and urgent contracts with neighboring states. Military experts noted that the precision of the strike demonstrated a high level of training. This meant that the enemy could have serious vulnerabilities deep within its territory. Now, every such factory or plant would be under close scrutiny. Diplomatic circles discussed whether this episode would lead to an escalation. Some countries were already preparing statements calling for restraint. Others, on the contrary, were considering the possibility of tightening sanctions or providing additional support to allies. These initial consequences only hinted at the depth of what was happening. In the fourth part, we will analyze the data and forecasts. We will look at how this event will affect the future of the conflict, what scenarios are possible, and how the international community will react. Analysts from around the world began to compare data on the strike and its consequences. Expert reports emphasized that this was not just a local episode, but an event capable of changing the very logic of the conflict. The destruction of a large factory showed that the enemy's industrial base was no longer inviolable. If it was previously believed that such facilities were relatively safe, that illusion has now disappeared. The first scenario discussed by experts was that the enemy would try to move production to smaller sites. This would spread the risks, but at the same time reduce efficiency and increase costs. Each new enterprise would have to be re-equipped, logistics would have to be set up, and skilled workers would have to be found. Such a process could take months or even years. The second scenario involved increased imports. The authorities would try to purchase the necessary components abroad using parallel supply chains. But there are difficulties here too. International attention to this issue has increased sharply, and many countries will seek to block such channels. Controls will become tighter and prices will rise. The third scenario looked the most alarming. It was that the enemy might try to make up for the losses by stepping up military action. Losing the plant hurt their capabilities, and they might take retaliatory steps in other areas to show their strength. This creates the risk of new outbreaks of tension. The international community's reaction was also divided. Some countries called for de-escalation and negotiations. They see the strike as a signal that further escalation will only lead to new destruction and losses. Other countries, on the contrary, see what has happened as proof of the need to continue supporting their allies. Parliaments have called for additional military aid and faster deliveries of equipment. Particular attention was paid to the information war. The version that the factory allegedly produced coffee machines was met with irony. Many media outlets ridiculed such statements, pointing out obvious inconsistencies. In the eyes of the international audience, this version only reinforced doubts about the veracity of the enemy's official information. As a result, diplomatic positions were weakened. For the domestic audience, the operation sent a serious psychological signal. It showed that being deep in the rear did not guarantee safety. Panic broke out in cities with large industrial enterprises. People began to discuss the possibility of new strikes, and some enterprises temporarily suspended operations. This undermined confidence in the authorities and heightened the atmosphere of anxiety. The historical context is also important. Such strikes on industrial facilities are not uncommon in world military history. They have always had a double effect. On the one hand, the destruction of factories reduced the enemy's production capacity. On the other hand, such actions sent a powerful signal to the international community. That is why the current episode has been compared to events in the mid-20th century, when strikes on infrastructure changed the strategic balance. The outlook for the near future remains uncertain. Experts cite several possible scenarios. The first is the gradual depletion of the enemy's industrial base and a reduction in its ability to produce high-tech products. The second is an attempt to compensate for losses through accelerated imports and new alliances with states willing to cooperate in circumventing international rules. The third is increased political pressure within the country, where society will increasingly demand an explanation as to why strategic facilities were left unprotected. Whatever the real scenario turns out to be, it is already clear today that the strike on the plant was a turning point. It demonstrated that the war of technology and industry is no less important than events on the front lines. Each new operation of this scale will change not only the tactical picture, but also the political atmosphere on the international stage. So we have come to the end of our story. We have seen how carefully the operation was prepared, how it was carried out, and what consequences it had. We have analyzed possible scenarios for the future and the reaction of the international community. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new reports and analytical materials. There are still many events ahead that will change the course of the conflict, and we will continue to report on them so that you can see the whole picture.